A devastated Liberian landmark with American origins.
They thought they could only fulfill their potential in Africa.
A Belgian town in the shadow of its destroyer.
It had to expand or die, but one group of people decided to do something about it.
An astronomical ruin above Lake Erie, a victim of its own success.
In an ironic turn of events, it was the growth of Cleveland itself that led to the demise of this observatory.
And a mountaintop retreat in Bolivia drained of its lifeblood.
This building looks like it's teetering on the edge of the world.
Decaying relics, ruins of lost worlds, sites haunted by the past, their secrets waiting to be revealed. In the heart of Liberia's capital, a disintegrating tower dominates the skyline.
In the middle of a busy street in downtown Monrovia is a rundown skyscraper.
What has survived are these decorative concrete slabs. Who are the people depicted here?
The inside is every bit as decrepit as the outside. Crumbling walls, rotting stairwells, it's just a mess.
There are still a few lingering traces of its former grandeur.
The standout feature is this massive abstract stained glass window.
One large room looks like an auditorium. Could this have been a cinema?
You would never believe that this was once one of Liberia's most important buildings.
Erected by a centuries-old organization with foundations in an American exodus, this hollow skyscraper would witness their spectacular downfall. Looking after this decaying building is an impossible task for its caretaker, Lucini Gray.
Very beautiful. Beautiful. They were up to date. These are all offices. You see how they looted the place. Him on here, as you can see, him on here have caused a lot of damages to the building.
Before its untimely demise, this was Monrovia's cultural hub.
The building was a combination of offices and an entertainment center, housing the largest auditorium in the entire country.
There were theater. They used to have movie shows here, all things happening.
It even had the best restaurants in Monrovia.
But its original function was primarily political.
When the building was erected, that means it was endorsed under the regime of the Tory party.
Built as the headquarters of the political party that would dominate a century of Liberian politics, it was named after the organization's first president, E.J. Roy, an American.
Edward James Roy was born in Newark, Ohio, and when he was 31, he decided to move himself to Liberia. He became a very wealthy and successful merchant, to the point at which he could even travel to the United States in his own ship.
Roy's rise to the head of one of the world's oldest political parties and the Liberian presidency began in the turmoil of 19th century America.
In 1816, a group of influential white Americans got together to discuss what they saw as the problem of growing numbers of emancipated African slaves.
They believed that with their newfound freedom, the former slaves would find it difficult to integrate into white America, and they thought they could only fulfill their potential in Africa.
So they established an organization called the American Colonization Society, or ACS, to fund and organize the transportation of former American slaves to West Africa and to set them up when they arrived. The federal government also assisted the ACS in buying an area of land.
This land would eventually become part of modern Liberia. Tempted by a new life away from the nation that had seen them enslaved for generations, thousands set sail for Liberia's shores.
Altogether, some 15,000 African Americans settled, and they became known as Americo-Liberians.
They built American-looking homes that resembled plantation homes. They built American-looking churches. They tried to create an American society, essentially, in Africa. Even its flag reflects this relationship to the United States because the two flags are strikingly similar.
In 1869, a group of these Americo-Liberians established the true Whig Party.
Only American settlers and their descendants were allowed to vote, so this eliminated any possibility of competition from competing parties.
When Roy took office in 1870, he was immediately faced with financial crisis.
His goal was to modernize Liberia, particularly its schools and infrastructure, but the way that he went about raising money for these projects would be his downfall.
He took punishing loans from British banks, which Liberia soon defaulted on, spiraling into recession.
Deep resentment grew towards Roy. He was accused of embezzlement and even brought to trial, but managed to escape before the sentencing. Less than 2 years after coming into office, he was overthrown and died in 1872.
The exact circumstances of Roy's death are unknown. One theory suggests he drowned while swimming to the safety of a British ship waiting in Monrovia's harbor.
Although one might think that Roy's presidency ended in disgrace, he is actually regarded as a hero in Liberia, which is why the party's building was built in his honor.
Some believe that this headquarters building was actually constructed on the spot where he was killed.
Completed in 1965, nearly a century after his death, the E.J. Roy Building became the headquarters of the true Whigs and stood testament to an era of Americo-Liberian control.
But it wouldn't end up being in use for very long because Liberia was about to be shaken to its very foundations. In 1980, a coup d'etat would bring an end to the party's long rule.
Aggrieved by centuries of dominance by the Americo-Liberian ruling class, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe led a group of indigenous Liberian soldiers into the president's mansion. There, they executed him and began targeting his ministers and party headquarters.
What led to the destruction of the building is a war. Because they felt that the former regime had been in power. A lot of the former officials in government were executed after they killed 13 men on the pool, executed them.
After they were ousted from power, the E.J. Roy Building was confiscated and left to decay.
A government agency eventually took over the building.
It became so derelict that it had to be closed for reconstruction.
In 2005, the True Whig Party made a bid to return to frontline Liberian politics. But reclaiming the E.J. Roy building is an uphill struggle.
They still see the building as the party's, and a fierce legal battle is ongoing to stop any construction or possession of the building by government officials.
The party has filed a $10 billion lawsuit against the government.
Even in its ruined state, this building is still regarded as a symbol and an icon of Liberia and Monrovia.
High in the Andes Mountains, above the city of La Paz, a ramshackle complex sits alone and exposed.
This building looks like it's teetering on the edge of the world.
The paintwork has degraded, roof panels are missing, and there's a faded grandeur to the place.
As you get closer, other structures appear to rise out of the barren earth.
This strange glass pyramid looks more like an art installation, almost like a mini Louvre.
Here, the air is thin and the weather ferocious.
This is extremely high altitude, 17,500 feet above sea level. That's higher than the base camp A at Everest.
This place was once busy and bustling with tourists who would come from all over the globe.
You can see something pretty dramatic has taken place.
This isn't an isolated case. What happened here is happening all across the planet, and the ramifications are only just beginning. This is Chacaltaya in western Bolivia. Together, these dilapidated structures hold an extraordinary claim to fame.
This is the highest ski resort in the world, but it doesn't really resemble a ski resort anymore. The slopes are empty, the bars silent.
Samuel Mendoza is the guardian of this site.
Muchos años, casi como 42 años estoy haciendo esta ruta. Y entonces me vengo desde más abajo, hay una laguna más grande. De ahí subo caminando toda esta montaña hasta arriba. Esto era más importante para mi vida.
He still remembers what this place was like in its heyday.
Era muy concurrido en esta montaña. Los esquiadores subían aquí y se desenganchaban. Toda esta montaña era con nieve.
Skiing was brilliant all year round, and it was rated as a Class 1 site for international skiing competition.
This place was so popular, it even hosted national ski championships.
After a day out on the slopes, visitors could let their hair down at the resort's central hub, the Club Andino Refuge.
En el día se practicaba deporte de esquí y en la noche era donde se pasaban así entre amigos la guitarreada, con algunos vinitos, así. Era divertido, era muy alegre estar aquí junto a ellos también.
Samuel would stay up here most nights.
Más o menos ya muchos años, pero con vela nomás, no teníamos electricidad. Esta cabaña para mí ha sido un lugar muy bonito, casi como mi casa también.
Living and skiing this high, however, was extremely taxing on the human body.
Bueno, nos encontramos 5.300 sobre el nivel del mar, donde algunos se sienten mal por falta de oxígeno. Esta pirámide sirve para las personas que se ponen mal de la altura. Entonces, por dentro hay una puerta, por ahí ingresan, por dentro había oxígeno.
Locals have another method of dealing with the altitude sickness.
Yo tomo un matecito de coca y eso es donde más me protege. Un poco tarda también en hervir por falta de oxígeno, ¿no? Si tiene un color verde, oscuro. Para mal de la cabeza, dolor de estómago.
For a long time, Chacaltaya thrived. But unbeknown to many, the resort was doomed. A hidden threat was about to change everything.
This used to be a full-scale glacier that lasted all year round. But as you can see from the lack of snow and ice, the situation has changed in recent years.
Lo que he notado es desde 2002, la tierra ya era más caliente. Ese año ya se podía esquiar, pero ya no en toda la pista. La mitad de la pista nomás ya era.
Scientists set up a measuring station to monitor the size of the glacier, and they noticed it was losing mass every year.
As global temperatures increase, the atmosphere gets warmer and warmer, and the altitude at which things freeze keeps getting higher and higher.
Once the glacier began to lose mass, it only accelerated, and this is due to the color, which determines its reflectivity. So as it lost ice, the color kept getting darker as the lower layer is mixed with more and more dirt.
Nobody appreciated quite how fast this would happen.
In 2005, scientists predicted that this glacier would last another 10 years. However, this was optimistic. By 2009, this 18,000-year-old glacier had completely disappeared.
With it came the closure of the resort.
Se nos ha, por los cambios climáticos, no tenemos nieve, está así. Ahora para mí es triste, ¿no? Sin nieve, sin poder esquiar, sin glaciar, es una pena.
The ramifications were far greater in La Paz, almost 6,000 feet below the resort.
These glaciers are not just commodities for tourists to enjoy. They're essential to supplying water to the neighboring communities.
They depended on the glaciers to hold the water during the rainy season, acting like a dam so that it would be available during the dry seasons.
And now that this glacier is gone, water rationing has become a reality for people in these communities.
Today, the mountain is silent. Yet Samuel still takes his familiar route to check on the refuge. For him, not all hope is lost.
Ya no tenemos visitantes y no hay también recursos económicos para hacer mantenimiento. Y yo me siento un poco triste, ¿no? Ver así la cabaña. Ojalá algún día vuelva a nevar. Tengo futuro.
Unfortunately, that looks more and more like wishful thinking.
As the situation with global warming only gets worse around the world, the situation at Chacaltaya is just going to grow more and more extreme. The glacier is likely never going to return.
On the banks of Belgium's River Scheldt lies the carcass of a once thriving town.
We're on the outskirts of Antwerp, Belgium's second city and a key piece of real estate within Europe.
This is an ordinary working-class neighborhood, sandwiched between the city and acres of farmland.
And it looks just really, really abandoned.
Remains of the lives lived here point to a recent exodus.
There's hardly a window that isn't boarded up, and the streets are quiet and silent.
It's almost like a time capsule, but from very recent history.
The dereliction on show doesn't offer an easy answer to what happened here.
This is not Pompeii. There's no huge natural disaster here. But where are all the people?
Dieter Verskuren is a local journalist. He has always known the Belgian town of Doel as a shell of its former self.
So this is the main street of Doel. When you enter the village, you always come through this road. But when lots of people lived here, you had a bakery and you have a grocery store and even a gas station, which is now all abandoned.
Some even find it ironic that this once purposeful community now stands neglected.
So sometimes you can see in the poems on the buildings that they have a small wordplay with the name Doel, because Doel means purpose in English as well.
Although the majority of the town is boarded up and empty, there are signs that a few stalwart residents continue to live amongst the relics of a better time.
This is one of the signs that people put out of their houses to show that the house is still being lived in. This particular sign says this isn't a zoo, just to prevent people or tourists standing around here and staring at their house. Because how would you feel if someone just comes and stands in front of your house and takes pictures of it? And as you can see, everything is being closely watched by cameras because they do have a lot of vandalism and they're trying everything to prevent that. And sadly, it's the only way to give large fines and have everything monitored by the cameras, which are all over the place. This isn't just like a movie set or a Hollywood theater. This actually is a village, and it's important that people know so they stop vandalizing it. They stop coming here acting like it's an amusement park, which it isn't.
Doel's inhabitants have been locked in a battle for the survival of their town for over half a century. The cause of this fight lies just beyond its vacant streets.
So right in front of me is the nuclear power plant of Doel. It's really an institute here. When you mention the name Doel, you immediately say nuclear power plant. It's an eyesight that you won't forget. It's always spectacular to see the large towers with the steam coming out of it.
Yet, it wasn't the spectre of nuclear meltdown that emptied the town, but another mega project on the far side of the river.
That's where all the container terminals are, where the large container ships come in. The people of Doel really live on the edge of the harbor and the industrial activities.
The Port of Antwerp is one of the busiest and biggest seaports in the entire world. And it has been at the top of that list, not just in recent history, for hundreds and hundreds of years. But in that time, shipping has changed.
As global consumerism took off in the second half of the 20th century, the infrastructure it required began to feel the strain.
Trade is ramping up in really fascinating, dynamic ways. There's not only food, there are chemicals, there's clothing. If the Port of Antwerp were to stay competitive, it had to expand or die.
Port authorities soon turned their attention to Doel.
They see this quaint little village sitting just across the river. And they don't just see a village, they see opportunity.
In 1963, the town was earmarked for demolition to make way for an expansion of the port. The 50-year battle to save Doel had begun.
This is a tiny village against the state and an incredibly wealthy port authority.
First, they have to get rid of the resident population.
The authorities began a coordinated effort to remove as many residents as possible.
It was actually made illegal to construct any more houses in this area.
Most folks just gave up the ghost. They pack up and leave. And the place starts its transformation from thriving quaint village to ghost town.
That must be very weird to have to leave your homes, leave everything behind, everything you know about your childhood. That must have been terrible for those people.
Despite the pressure, the people fought back. Local council member Baudouin Vlegels remembers how it played out.
Groep die dus het behoud van Doel wilde bestendigen. En die hebben al die jaren dus positie gevoerd om het te behouden.
The work of the activists certainly raised the profile of Doel. Suddenly, people in Antwerp were aware that this area was not going to go down without a fight. If the authorities wanted a quiet land grab, the activists made sure that this was never going to happen.
By 1978, after 15 years of battling the plans, it seemed that David had beaten Goliath.
The plans to clear the village were placed on hold, but this is by no means the end of the story.
By the 1990s, it became clear that the fight wasn't over yet.
Men voelde zich daar niet goed bij, omdat men niet zeker was om hier te kunnen blijven wonen. En die onzekerheid.
Starting in 1995, the authorities again looked to empty the town.
They offered to buy the homes of any remaining residents. And they gave the impression that the longer the residents waited, the lower the offer on the homes would be.
It's about this time that the population of Doel goes from about 900 to 300 or 400, and things really become desperate at this point.
Officially, the idea was that the houses would be rented to residents as the fate of the village was being decided. But what happened was a lot of the buildings were simply abandoned and started to fall into disrepair, which suited the authorities just fine.
But just as the previous generation had in the 1960s and 70s, residents and concerned citizens pulled together.
One group decides they're not going to lay down and just take it. They're going to fight.
There were protests, there were rallies, there was petitions. People wanted their voices to be heard.
The battle to save the town raged for over a decade. Despite all the campaigners' efforts, in 2008, all seemed to be lost.
The authorities took the brutal decision to send in the bulldozers. They knew it would look bad, and it did, but the bulldozers went in and started knocking down buildings.
But soon, there was a breakthrough.
In 2009, it was ruled the state could not forcibly remove the residents, so the bulldozing was stopped.
They were essentially at a stalemate, the state being stopped in its tracks by the proletariat.
In 2018, more than 50 years after the first plans to destroy Doel were announced, the remaining residents received a welcome bit of news.
It was decided that the port of Antwerp would be extended elsewhere, leaving the residents of Doel safe.
Ja, ik ben ervan overtuigd dat Doel terug een mooie toekomst heeft. Hè? En dat we terug van Doel iets moois kunnen maken voor de ganse streek. Waar we allemaal veel plezier aan kunnen hebben.
In Cleveland, Ohio, sits a once noble structure intended to help satisfy humankind's thirst for knowledge.
It looks like a pretty residential road on the edge of East Cleveland, but if you look closer, you'll see that it's a hulking building sitting on a hillside overlooking the town.
It's got odd wings going off in different angles, but most dramatically, there are two large domes on the roof.
The old domes are majestic, but they're completely falling apart.
Built at a time of technological innovation, this site played its part in a great scientific discovery.
It's clear this was an observatory meant for gazing into the heavens, but the neighborhood it's in is not the kind you would typically put an observatory today.
Vines and decay have accumulated on the walls, but somehow the academic grandeur has remained intact for all these years.
The overall aspect is one of sadness, really. Clearly, this was an important structure in its day, and now it is neglected.
Who built this center of learning? And how did the march of progress bring it all crashing back down to earth?
I was here on my wedding day. I was married in the observatory 41 years ago. I think to be back here, it seems like it might be a little bit daunting inside. I'm a little bit worried about the integrity of the building, the integrity of the floors. We'll just sort of see how it goes.
Monica Pershey lives locally. Back in 1980, Ed, her husband-to-be, was studying the history of astronomy. The observatory was their dream wedding venue.
So we were looking for a place to be married, and Ed said, how about the observatory? Ed had his interest in astronomy and in telescopes and all sorts of technological equipment. My father, my uncles all worked at NASA. So I grew up with space exploration as a daily event in my household. So it just seemed to kind of fall together. It was snowing, late December, very, very cold. We were married in the morning, so it was still kind of dim and cloudy. And it was a beautiful building at the time, and it was warm and cozy inside.
Like many of the city's residents, this building holds a special place in their hearts, which makes its demise all the more upsetting.
I kind of feel like it didn't have to be this way. Things do fall apart, but the vandalism is particularly heartbreaking to me. It was very different than it is now. The room had a large brass rail in the middle. Along the walls were murals, notably astronomers, Galileo, Copernicus, as I recall. There was a lot of woodwork. It had a very luxurious feel to it.
The observatory was first opened in the 1920s, but the story of its conception dates back 4 decades earlier, when 2 men, Worcester Reed Warner and Ambrose Swasey, decided to go into business.
So in 1880, Cleveland was one of the most important iron-making centers of the United States. The Warner and Swasey Company quickly became a leading manufacturer of precision tools and machine instruments. But it was with their telescopes that they managed to change the world.
They weren't academics, they weren't scientists, and they certainly weren't astronomers. They were just 2 passionate individuals who desperately wanted to know more about what's out there beyond Earth.
The successful businessmen were also keen philanthropists and tried to put their wealth to good use.
Looking up at the stars on a clear night was their shared passion, but they wanted it to be so much more than just a hobby.
This is the Warner and Swasey Observatory, named after the 2 men who funded its construction.
For many years, this is where students from what is now Case Western Reserve University did astronomical observations. There was a prime site.
John Grabowski is a historian at Case Western Reserve University today. As a Cleveland native, he understands the importance of the observatory to the local community.
This site is really, it's a landmark in the city's history because it links to several things. One, it links to the rise of science and astronomy in Cleveland, and that really links directly to the creation of the Case School of Applied Science in 1881. And it also really reflects on the industrial history of Cleveland because the late 19th century, Cleveland was burgeoning with industrial activity and the science that was being funded and really pushed forward by people like the Warner and Swasey.
The telescope Warner and Swasey made for this observatory was a 9.5-inch refractor telescope. In 1920, when this telescope was installed, it wasn't really on the cutting edge. There were much larger telescopes in use in other parts of the world.
Well, we are now in the dome room for the first telescope that was here. And as we look around the dome room right now, you can see the mechanism, the rollers to move the dome. You can see the slit where the telescope would have been through. So this was, the mechanics, the typical mechanics for an observatory at that point.
As the decades passed, the capability of the observatory's telescope was soon eclipsed by more powerful models. If this site was to play any meaningful role in scientific advancement, it was going to need some serious investment. In November 1941, a brand new 24-inch telescope was installed.
Well, the second dome was for a larger telescope. It has a spectrometer, it has technologies that allow them to capture images, and that really enhances the seeing here.
Over the next 20 or so years, some really significant work would be done at this observatory.
Scientists managed to prove the theory that the Milky Way was a spiral galaxy, and the cooler stars were located near its center.
This is a really important discovery in understanding both the formation of galaxies, but also their evolution, their life cycle.
But the observatory's position at the forefront of astronomical research was under threat. A powerful force was encroaching from the west.
The outskirts of Cleveland turned out to be a really unfortunate place to build an observatory. As the city grew, so did the halo of light that surrounded its downtown and suburbs. And with each new street light and home and car headlight, the skies became brighter and the stars became dimmer.
The fact that the city grew around it, this became a bad place to look at the stars because the light pollution was so bad here.
It became pretty clear that the golden age of observation was coming to an end for the observatory.
The city's light pollution meant the Warner and Swasey Observatory was now only useful as a setting for local amateurs to explore the heavens.
So the observatory transitioned from being a place of science to a place of the people.
This became a great place for the public to come and learn a little bit about astronomy and get some wonderful glimpses of the planets and the stars.
The observatory was hailed as one of the best in the country for public viewing. But by the 1980s, its star had fallen so low, it was entirely abandoned.
The observatory lost its scientific value, failed to pull in visitors, and it was the end of an era for star lovers.
The impact of Warner and Swasey's investment can still be felt all across the city. The observatory that bears their names will always be remembered fondly.
They created one of the major industries in Cleveland, but both of them invested their fortunes in education and in science. The domes are a place where generations of students and scientists looked at the sky and tried to discern what was out there, tried to discover new things. And that makes it special.